My husband vanished for 6 long days and finally walked back in with a smug grin saying, "You should be thankful I even came home." I looked at him calmly and replied, "You're right, thank you. But this isn't your home anymore." Then I handed him the yellow envelope and watched every trace of color drain from his face. "You should be grateful I even came home." Silas stood in our hallway after 6 days of silence, looking refreshed and radiant, expecting gratitude for returning from the affair I'd already documented. He thought I was still the accommodating wife who'd ignore cologne I didn't buy and lies about conferences that didn't exist. He was wrong. But to understand how catastrophically wrong he was, I need to take you back 3 months to when I still believed in the marriage I thought we had. Back to when I was still Eliza Brennan who made excuses for suspicious behavior and convinced herself that trust meant not asking uncomfortable questions. Back to before I discovered that the foundation of 12 years together had been quietly dissolving while I was too busy maintaining appearances to notice the cracks. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and sharing these stories of resilience and strategic strength. If you believe that betrayal deserves accountability and that protecting yourself matters, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. My name is Eliza Brennan, and I'm a marketing consultant in Chicago specializing in brand strategy for mid-sized firms navigating digital transformation. For 7 years I'd been married to Silas Montgomery, an architect at Morrison & Associates, one of the city's respected design firms. Before marriage, we'd dated for 5 years, which meant we'd spent 12 years total building what I'd believed was an unshakable partnership. Long enough to think I knew someone completely. Long enough to be devastatingly wrong. We'd met at a community theater production of Our Town, where I was managing publicity and he was building sets. I remembered watching him work during rehearsals, the careful precision with which he measured lumber and assembled the skeletal structures that would become the play's temporary world. He'd approached me during a break, sawdust still clinging to his shirt, and asked if I wanted coffee. We'd talked for 3 hours at a diner 2 blocks from the theater, sketching dreams and future plans on paper napkins that we'd both saved for months afterward like they were precious artifacts marking the beginning of something significant. Those early years had been defined by beautiful struggle. Silas was establishing himself as an architect in a brutally competitive market, taking projects that paid poorly but built his portfolio and reputation. I was climbing from junior consultant to senior strategist, working 16-hour days to prove myself indispensable to clients who initially questioned whether someone my age could deliver strategic value. We'd survived on takeout food and shared ambition, celebrating small victories with champagne we couldn't quite afford and intimate dinners in our tiny apartment where the kitchen and living room occupied the same 12-foot space. My mother had disapproved initially, calling Silas's career path unstable and questioning whether an architect could provide the security she'd envisioned for my future. We'd proven her wrong together, or so I'd believed at the time. By the time we married, we'd both achieved versions of success that felt hard-earned and deeply shared. Silas had landed his position at Morrison & Associates where he'd eventually advanced to senior designer. My consulting practice had grown until I was pulling 6-figure contracts and turning down projects because my schedule couldn't accommodate additional clients. We'd moved into a 2-bedroom condominium with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a space we'd furnished gradually with pieces that represented our combined aesthetic. Not luxurious by any means, but comfortable and undeniably ours. The condominium had been purchased primarily with inheritance money I'd received from my grandmother, a detail that would later prove legally significant in ways I couldn't have anticipated during those optimistic early years. Our life together had developed rhythms that felt like the architecture of genuine partnership. Saturday mornings were reserved for the farmers market near Lincoln Park, where Silas would select produce with the same careful attention he applied to building materials while I managed our reusable bags and provided running commentary about overpriced organic kale. Friday nights meant movie nights with takeout from the Thai restaurant on the corner, his choice of film alternating with mine in a democratic system we'd maintained for years. We hosted dinner parties where friends regularly called us the couple that makes marriage look easy, a compliment I'd accepted with pride that now felt like evidence of my own willful blindness. I'd treasured the small intimacies most. The way Silas would read passages from architecture journals aloud while I worked on client presentations at the dining table, sharing interesting design concepts like they were treasures he wanted me to appreciate. Our accumulated inside jokes and references that made us feel like we spoke a private language only we understood. The comfortable silence of two people who didn't require constant conversation to feel connected. Those details had comprised my evidence that our marriage was solid, functional, maybe even enviable to others who struggled with partnership dynamics. The changes had begun approximately 3 months before that devastating doorway confrontation. Subtle at first, easy to rationalize individually, but forming a pattern I'd actively chosen not to recognize as significant until the evidence became impossible to ignore. Silas started waking earlier than usual, his alarm suddenly set for 5:30 instead of the 6:15 he'd maintained for our entire relationship. He'd spend extended periods in the bathroom with the door locked, emerging already dressed and smelling of cologne I absolutely didn't recognize. The scent was expensive, distinctive, nothing remotely similar to the drugstore aftershave he'd worn throughout our years together. When I'd asked about it casually one morning, he'd mentioned something vague about receiving a sample at a client meeting, a detail too minor to challenge directly but notable enough to lodge in my memory. His phone behavior shifted dramatically during this period. The device that used to sit casually on countertops and nightstands became permanently attached to his person, always positioned face down, always within immediate arm's reach. When I'd enter a room where he was texting or scrolling, he'd shift the screen away with movements that were just slightly too quick, just slightly too deliberate to be unconscious. His laptop acquired new password protections seemingly overnight. Websites that used to load automatically now required authentication. Small digital fortifications that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested someone methodically building walls. Financial irregularities began appearing in our joint account statements. Cash withdrawals occurred every Thursday without exception, always exactly $200, amounts carefully calibrated to avoid triggering any fraud alerts but consistent enough to establish an unmistakable pattern once I started paying attention. Charges appeared for restaurants we'd never visited together, always on weeknights when he claimed to be working late on demanding projects. When I'd asked about his extended hours at the office, his explanations grew progressively shorter and noticeably more defensive in tone. "It's a demanding project, Eliza. You understand how deadlines work," he'd say with an edge of irritation that felt designed to discourage further questions. I did understand deadlines intimately. They were central to my own consulting work. But deadlines in my experience didn't typically require new cologne, secretive phone behavior, or regular cash withdrawals that formed suspicious patterns. My best friend Claire had noticed my deterioration before I'd fully admitted the problem to myself. During our monthly coffee meetup at our usual spot near Millennium Park, she'd studied me with the professional assessment of someone who spent her entire career documenting the dissolution of relationships. Claire was a divorce attorney, one of the most successful in Chicago, and someone I'd known since our college years who understood me well enough to recognize when something fundamental had shifted in my life. "You look completely exhausted," she'd said, not as casual observation but as clinical diagnosis that demanded explanation. "What's actually happening with you?" I'd found myself confessing details I hadn't consciously planned to share with anyone. Silas's growing emotional distance. The unexplained schedule changes. The cologne that smelled like expensive secrets. The phone guarding that suggested he was protecting information he didn't want me to access. The mounting sense that I was living with someone who remained physically present but had emotionally relocated to somewhere I wasn't invited to follow. Claire had listened without visible judgment, but I'd seen the recognition flash across her expression, the professional acknowledgement of a behavioral pattern she'd witnessed countless times in her legal practice. "Eliza, I've encountered this exact combination of behaviors at least 1,000 times professionally," she'd said carefully, her tone balanced precisely between personal friendship and professional observation. "I'm not definitively stating that Silas is having an affair, but I need you to understand that what you're describing represents textbook warning signs. Trust your instincts on this. They're usually accurate, and most people actually know the truth long before they're psychologically ready to consciously admit it to themselves." She hadn't pushed further after planting that seed. Claire understood intuitively that I needed to arrive at the conclusion independently rather than having it imposed from external sources. But that night, lying beside Silas as he scrolled through his phone with his back deliberately turned toward me, I'd felt something crack audibly inside my chest. Not my heart breaking exactly, but rather the foundation of my denial fracturing under the accumulated weight of evidence I could no longer successfully rationalize away. I'd been performing ignorance, actively protecting myself from a truth I'd already half discovered, and Claire's carefully chosen words had stripped away the last protective layer of willful blindness I'd been maintaining. The definitive confirmation arrived on a Tuesday evening when Silas made his first significant operational mistake. He left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered, singing a John Mayer song I'd never once heard him play during our entire relationship. The screen glowed with his email inbox, and a notification appeared that fundamentally reorganized my understanding of reality. Last night was incredible. He's clueless. Can't wait for next week. The sender's name was Jennifer Caldwell, someone Silas had mentioned perhaps a dozen times over 3 years as his project manager at Morrison & Associates. Competent, he'd always said. Professional. Strictly business, nothing more. My hands trembled as I read the preview text repeatedly, hoping desperately that I'd somehow misunderstood the plain meaning of the words displayed before me, knowing absolutely that I hadn't. I didn't open the full email to read additional details. I didn't need to see more. Those 2 sentences contained everything necessary to understand what had been happening. My husband was having an affair. The woman involved knew about my existence and found my ignorance amusing enough to reference directly. They were actively planning future encounters with the casual comfort of an established pattern. I closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it, maintaining the precise angle and screen position. My mind felt eerily calm despite my heart racing with adrenaline. I returned to the kitchen counter where I'd been chopping vegetables for the stir-fry we'd planned to share, picked up the knife I'd set down moments earlier, and resumed the mechanical task. Each slice of the blade against the cutting board marked the ending of one version of my life and the beginning of something I couldn't yet fully envision. When Silas emerged from the bathroom wearing fresh clothes and that now identifiable cologne, he kissed my cheek with practiced affection that felt completely hollow. The gesture seemed rehearsed, performative, a routine maintained strictly for appearances rather than genuine emotional connection. He asked about my day using the tone of someone fulfilling an obligation. I responded with surface details about a client presentation, my voice remaining steady despite the chaos actively reorganizing itself inside my chest. We sat down to dinner together as we had countless evenings before. I watched him eat. I watched him scroll through his phone between bites with casual entitlement. I watched him exist in our supposedly shared space while clearly thinking about someone else, somewhere else, planning encounters that excluded and betrayed me. I smiled appropriately. I asked follow-up questions about his project deadlines that I now understood were partially fictional. I maintained the complete performance of normalcy while understanding with devastating clarity that I was sitting directly across from a stranger who merely happened to wear my husband's familiar face. The foundation hadn't just developed cracks. It had dissolved entirely beneath me, and I was only beginning to comprehend the full scope of what that collapse actually meant for everything I'd built my adult life around. The morning after discovering that email, I woke at 5 and couldn't fall back asleep. Silas was still breathing deeply beside me, oblivious to the fact that the woman lying next to him had stopped being his wife in any meaningful sense and had become something closer to an investigator documenting a crime scene. I slipped out of bed quietly, made coffee I couldn't taste, and sat in my car outside a coffee shop 3 blocks from my office at 7 in the morning, staring at Claire's contact information on my phone screen. My pride wrestled violently with my survival instinct. Asking my best friend for divorce attorney recommendations felt like publicly announcing my marriage's death certificate, transforming private suspicion into irreversible reality. Once I made this call, there would be no pretending I'd misunderstood that email or that some innocent explanation existed for cologne and Thursday night hotel charges. This call would make the betrayal official, would force me to stop performing the role of trusting wife and start preparing for the role of ex-wife. But the alternative terrified me more. Confronting Silas without preparation, letting raw emotion drive my strategy, felt like walking into battle completely unarmed while my opponent had been planning his campaign for months. I pressed call before I could change my mind. Claire answered on the second ring, her voice warm with the assumption this was a normal friendly check-in. Eliza, hey. Everything okay? I need a referral, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. For myself. A divorce attorney. The silence on the other end lasted perhaps 3 seconds but felt substantially longer. When Claire spoke again, her tone had shifted entirely from personal friend to seasoned professional who'd heard this exact sentence from desperate women countless times before. Vivian Torres, she said without hesitation, without questions I wasn't ready to answer, without platitudes about marriage counseling or working things out. She's brilliant, absolutely thorough, and she doesn't lose cases. I'll text you her number right now. 20 minutes later, I was scheduling a consultation during a lunch break that Silas would assume I'd spent at my usual Thursday yoga class. The receptionist offered me an appointment for the following week. I asked if anything was available sooner. She found a cancellation for that same afternoon at 2. Vivian Torres's office occupied the 43rd floor of a building overlooking Lake Michigan, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city look both magnificent and indifferent to individual human suffering. Vivian herself was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-50s with silver hair cut in a precise bob and a no-nonsense demeanor that somehow made me feel safer despite discussing the collapse of my marriage with a complete stranger. She listened to my story without visible reaction, taking occasional notes on a legal pad while I described the email, the cologne, the Thursday night pattern, the growing distance. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned forward slightly. Eliza, I'm going to be extremely direct because that's what you need right now. You have exactly 2 options. React emotionally immediately and lose significant leverage, or gather evidence methodically over the next several weeks and control the outcome completely. Which option do you want? The second one, I said without hesitation. Good, Vivian replied. Then we need to talk about documentation, financial protection, and strategic timing. This is going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to feel like you're doing something wrong by investigating your own husband. You're not. You're protecting yourself from someone who's already demonstrated that your well-being isn't his priority. Over the next 3 weeks, I transformed into someone I barely recognized in the mirror. I became a detective in my own marriage, a woman who photographed credit card statements when Silas left them on the kitchen counter, who documented the patterns of his text message behavior, who accessed our family phone plan online to track his location during his supposed late nights at the office. The process felt dirty in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd spent 12 years building trust with this man, and now I was systematically dismantling that trust from the inside while pretending nothing had changed. But Vivian's words echoed constantly during moments when guilt threatened to derail my resolve. Documentation is protection. You're not violating his privacy. You're gathering evidence of how he violated your partnership. The credit card statements revealed a pattern that made my stomach turn. Silas had been visiting the Lakeside Boutique Hotel every Thursday night for the past 4 months, charging rooms to our joint credit card at $175 per visit. He was literally using our shared money to fund his affair, the financial equivalent of making me pay for my own betrayal. I photographed every statement, highlighted every charge, created a spreadsheet that tracked dates and amounts with color-coded precision. The cash withdrawals formed their own damning pattern. Every Wednesday without fail, Silas withdrew exactly $200 from our joint account at an ATM near his office. The amounts were carefully calibrated to avoid triggering any fraud alerts but consistent enough to clearly fund a parallel life I wasn't supposed to know existed. Dinner receipts appeared for restaurants we'd never visited together, always on Thursday evenings, always for 2 people, always charged to our joint card before the hotel room. I created a master spreadsheet that would have impressed my most detail-oriented clients. Color-coded rows tracked every lie he'd told about late meetings, every Thursday he'd claimed to work late on demanding projects, every expense that couldn't be explained by legitimate architectural work. Dates, amounts, locations, all meticulously documented. I was building a legal case against the man I'd promised to love forever. And the irony wasn't lost on me that I was applying the same strategic thinking to ending my marriage that I applied to building brands for corporate clients. The hardest part wasn't the investigation itself. The hardest part was maintaining absolute normalcy while conducting it. I cooked dinners and asked about his day. I laughed at his jokes even though they no longer felt funny. I kissed him goodbye in the mornings and welcomed him home in the evenings, all while knowing that every word out of his mouth carried lies I was systematically cataloging for future use. My sister Nina noticed something was wrong during our weekly phone call about 2 weeks into my investigation. Nina lived in Milwaukee, worked as a graphic designer, and possessed exactly zero ability to hide her emotions or moderate her reactions. "You sound completely weird," she said bluntly halfway through our conversation. What's actually wrong? I hesitated, knowing that telling Nina would open a door I couldn't close. But the weight of carrying this alone had become unsustainable, and I needed someone in my family to know the truth even if I wasn't ready for broader exposure. The confession poured out in a flood I couldn't control. The email. The cologne. The hotel charges. The evidence I'd been gathering. Nina's response was immediate and entirely predictable. I'm going to kill him, she said, her voice rising with genuine rage. I'm literally going to drive to Chicago right now and set his office on fire. Or maybe just his car. Does he still park in that garage on State Street? Nina, no, I said firmly, recognizing the dangerous edge in her voice. You can't do anything. If you confront him or cause any kind of scene, you'll completely ruin my legal strategy. Over the following days, Nina called repeatedly, each conversation escalating in intensity. She wanted to confront Silas directly. She wanted to expose him publicly on social media. She wanted to accidentally encounter him and Jennifer somewhere with her camera phone ready. Her protective rage was cathartic to witness but terrifying to manage. You need to promise me you'll let me handle this my way, I insisted during one particularly heated conversation. Vivian has a strategy. If you interfere, you could actually hurt my case. Nina agreed reluctantly, but I could hear the barely restrained fury in her voice. The situation became more complicated when she mentioned telling our mother Eleanor, a traditional woman who'd always adored Silas and believed strongly in the sanctity of marriage vows. Mom needs to know what he's doing to you, Nina argued. She deserves to understand why her son-in-law is a lying piece of. No, I interrupted. Mom can't know yet. She'll try to fix it. She'll want me to go to counseling or give him another chance or pray about it. I can't deal with that right now. Nina promised silence, but I heard the difficulty of that promise in her voice. My sister had never been good at keeping secrets, especially ones that made her angry. The breakthrough in my investigation came when Vivian recommended a private investigator named Marcus Webb. Marcus was a former Chicago police detective who'd transitioned into private investigation work specializing in marital cases. He was expensive, requiring $2,000 upfront, but Vivian promised he was worth every cent. He'll get you photographs, comprehensive documentation, behavioral patterns, everything you'll need for settlement negotiations, she explained. This isn't about punishing your husband. It's about ensuring you have leverage. Marcus worked for exactly 2 weeks, following Silas during his supposed late nights and weekend site visits. When he delivered his report, professionally bound with tabs separating different categories of evidence, I had to sit down before opening it. The photographs were devastating in their casual intimacy. Silas and Jennifer walking hand in hand along a beach I didn't recognize. Sharing dinner at a restaurant with wine glasses and candlelight. Kissing in a parking lot with the comfortable ease of an established couple rather than the nervous excitement of a new affair. Every image was time-stamped and geotagged, creating an irrefutable timeline that matched exactly with the dates Silas had claimed to be working late or visiting project sites. But Marcus's report contained information beyond the affair itself. He discovered that Silas had been renting a lakeside cabin 40 minutes outside Chicago for the past 6 months. The rental agreement was in his name, paid with our joint credit card, a romantic getaway property he'd been using for extended encounters I'd known nothing about. The financial analysis Marcus included hit hardest. He'd calculated that Silas had spent approximately $12,000 of our joint savings on this affair over the past 6 months. Hotel rooms, restaurant dinners, the cabin rental, gifts that Jennifer received while I received nothing. Our shared money funding his betrayal. Marcus looked at me across his desk with an expression that mixed professional detachment with genuine sympathy. Mrs. Montgomery, your husband isn't just cheating, he said quietly. He's actively stealing from your shared future to fund it. That matters legally. That changes the calculation significantly. I drove home that evening with Marcus's report in my bag and a clarity I hadn't possessed before. This wasn't just an affair born from temporary dissatisfaction or midlife crisis. This was calculated, sustained, financially significant betrayal. Silas had been building a parallel life while allowing me to subsidize both his legitimate existence and his secret one. That night at dinner, I watched him eat the pasta I'd prepared and felt absolutely nothing. No love, no anger, just cold assessment of someone who'd proven himself unworthy of either emotion. The Friday morning Silas left arrived with deceptive normalcy. He emerged from the bedroom at his usual time, dressed in business casual attire with his small rolling suitcase already packed and waiting by the door. He approached me in the kitchen where I was preparing coffee and kissed my forehead with the same practiced affection he'd displayed for months, a gesture that now felt entirely mechanical. "Conference in Minneapolis this weekend," he announced, his tone carrying the casual confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this lie until it sounded natural. "Probably back Sunday evening, maybe Monday morning at the latest. Big potential client presentation. Can't miss this opportunity." I turned to face him, arranging my expression into what I hoped resembled supportive concern rather than the cold assessment I actually felt. "Good luck with the presentation," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "I'll miss you." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, bitter and false, but I delivered them with the same performance quality he'd been demonstrating for months. He smiled, squeezed my hand briefly, grabbed his suitcase and walked out the door. Through the kitchen window, I watched his car exit our building's parking garage and disappear into morning traffic. The moment his vehicle was out of sight, I picked up my phone and called Vivian. She answered immediately despite the early hour. "He's gone," I said without preamble. "Told me he's attending a conference in Minneapolis. Back Sunday or Monday." "Verify it," Vivian responded instantly, her tone all business. "Call his office. Confirm whether the conference actually exists." I pulled up the main number for Morrison and Associates, the architectural firm where Silas had worked for the past 5 years. The HR coordinator answered on the third ring with professional cheerfulness. "Hi, this is Eliza Montgomery," I said, manufacturing concerned confusion in my voice. "I'm trying to reach my husband Silas, who's at your Minneapolis conference this weekend, but I've completely forgotten which hotel you're using. Can you help me with that information?" The pause on the other end lasted just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. When the coordinator spoke again, her tone carried genuine confusion rather than professional discretion. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm sorry, but we don't have any conferences scheduled anywhere this quarter. Our next company event isn't until the spring symposium in March. Are you certain about the location and dates?" I thanked her politely, maintained my composed tone despite the confirmation burning through my chest, and ended the call. Silas hadn't gone to Minneapolis for any legitimate business purpose. He'd gone wherever Jennifer was waiting, probably to that lakeside cabin Marcus had documented, and he'd constructed this elaborate lie with such practiced ease that it was absolutely clear this wasn't his first fictional conference. Sunday arrived and passed with complete silence, broken only by a single text message that appeared on my phone at 9 in the evening. Extended. Don't wait up. No apology for the change in plans. No explanation for why a weekend conference had suddenly expanded into something longer. Just casual dismissal delivered in 6 words that assumed I'd accept whatever narrative he chose to provide. I stared at that message for several minutes, feeling something shift fundamentally inside me. The abandonment I might have felt during earlier stages of our relationship had transformed into something colder and infinitely more dangerous to him. Strategic resolve. Monday morning, I began dismantling our shared life with surgical precision. The locks changed first. I contacted a 24-hour locksmith service and had them install completely new mechanisms on our condominium door by noon. The lease was solely in my name, something I'd established 3 years earlier when we'd moved into this building using inheritance money from my grandmother. That detail, which had seemed irrelevant during happier times when we'd believed our partnership was permanent, now became crucial legal protection. I contacted our building management office and updated the authorized occupant list, formally removing Silas Montgomery from any access rights to the property. The property manager expressed mild surprise but processed the change without requiring extensive explanation. Building policy allowed leaseholders to modify access privileges at their discretion. Tuesday, I addressed our financial entanglement. I contacted our credit card companies and canceled the cards attached to our joint account, timing the cancellations carefully to ensure any charges Silas might attempt during his absence would be declined. I opened a new checking account at an entirely different financial institution and redirected my consulting income, which had been funding the majority of our joint expenses for the past 2 years. Every transfer was documented meticulously with notes explaining that I was protecting marital assets from further dissipation due to suspected misconduct. Wednesday brought the emotionally complex task of packing his belongings. I moved through our condominium methodically, gathering his clothing from the closet we'd shared, his toiletries from the bathroom, his architecture books from the shelves he'd installed himself 3 years ago. His collection of design journals, his drafting tools, his framed photographs from projects he'd completed, all of it went into boxes I stacked in the guest room with the systematic efficiency of someone cataloging artifacts for permanent storage. Each item I packed carried memories that wanted to surface. The shirt he'd worn on our anniversary trip to Michigan. The watch I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago. The sketchbook where he'd drawn preliminary concepts for projects while we'd sat together on lazy Sunday mornings. I forced myself to treat these objects as evidence of a life that had already ended rather than remnants of something worth grieving. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford during these critical 72 hours. The physical dismantling felt both devastating and strangely empowering. I was actively choosing my response rather than passively accepting whatever narrative Silas would eventually present upon his return. 12 years of accumulated partnership compressed into boxes and policy changes, the architecture of our shared existence systematically deconstructed while he was presumably building intimate memories with someone else. Marcus called Wednesday afternoon, day 5 of Silas's unexplained absence, with an update delivered in his characteristically direct manner. "I have what you need," he said simply. "Can you meet?" We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in a neighborhood far from anywhere I typically frequented, reducing any chance of encountering someone who might recognize me and ask uncomfortable questions I wasn't prepared to answer publicly. Marcus arrived carrying a manila envelope and a USB drive, both of which he placed on the table between us with the solemnity of someone delivering crucial evidence in a criminal investigation. The printed photographs he spread before me showed Silas and Jennifer at what I now recognized as the lakeside cabin from his earlier surveillance reports. These images were different from the previous documentation, more intimate and somehow more damaging in their casual domesticity. They were cooking together in the cabin's small kitchen, Jennifer laughing at something while Silas stood behind her with his arms around her waist. They were sitting on the deck with wine glasses catching sunset light, their body language displaying the comfortable ease of an established couple rather than the nervous excitement of a new affair. One photograph in particular struck me with physical force. Silas and Jennifer at a small restaurant in the nearby town, sitting across from each other at a corner table. Silas wore the new navy jacket I'd noticed hanging in our closet last month, something I'd assumed he'd purchased for work presentations. Jennifer wore a delicate silver necklace that caught the light in ways that suggested it was expensive, possibly a gift funded by money from our joint accounts. Marcus had also captured them loading grocery bags into Silas's car, ordinary domestic activities that looked exactly like a couple on vacation managing the practical details of their temporary shared life. The ordinariness of it somehow made the betrayal more complete. "They're not hiding," Marcus observed, watching my face process the images. "They're comfortable, established, not taking particular precautions. This isn't new behavior for them. This is routine." He handed me the cabin's rental agreement, which he'd somehow managed to obtain through methods he declined to specify. Silas had signed it using his real name and paid the deposit with our joint credit card. The arrogance was breathtaking. He'd literally charged his affair accommodations to our shared account, making me an unwitting financial participant in my own betrayal. Thursday evening, with Silas entering his 6th consecutive day of unexplained absence, I sat at our dining room table with documents spread before me like battle plans. Vivian was on speakerphone, guiding me through the assembly of what she called the accountability package. We compiled everything into a single yellow legal envelope. The divorce petition Vivian had filed that morning with the county clerk. Photographic evidence from Marcus with dates, locations and activities carefully annotated. Credit card statements with highlighter marking every affair-related expense. Bank records documenting my asset protection transfers accompanied by detailed notes explaining the legal justification for each action. A formal cease and desist letter restricting Silas's access to marital accounts. The building management letter confirming his removal from our condominium's authorized occupant list. Vivian had also prepared a comprehensive financial analysis calculating that Silas had dissipated approximately $12,000 of marital funds on this affair over 6 months. Hotel charges, restaurant bills, the cabin rental, gifts, all itemized with the precision of a forensic audit. This documentation would become central to property division arguments. "This is your insurance policy," Vivian explained, her voice carrying professional satisfaction. "When he returns, and he absolutely will return because men like this always assume they can manage multiple realities indefinitely, you hand him this envelope. Don't argue. Don't explain. Don't engage emotionally. Just hand it to him and watch his understanding of the situation reset completely in real time." I sealed the yellow envelope and placed it precisely in the center of our coffee table, positioned where it would be immediately visible to anyone entering the condominium. It sat there like a landmine waiting to be triggered, like a bomb with a timer set to detonate the moment Silas walked through the door he no longer had keys to access. That night I slept better than I had in months. Not from happiness or satisfaction, but from the profound relief of knowing I'd converted pain into strategy and grief into protection. I'd spent 6 days building consequences while Silas had spent 6 days believing consequences didn't apply to him. Friday evening arrived with the weight of inevitability. I'd spent the day working from home, attempting to focus on client presentations while my attention kept drifting to the yellow envelope positioned precisely in the center of the coffee table. Around 6 o'clock, I heard the distinctive sound of a key attempting to turn in the lock that no longer recognized it. The metallic scraping continued for several seconds, confusion evident in the increasingly forceful attempts. Then silence. 30 seconds later my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. "I'm outside. Lock isn't working." I stood slowly, picked up the yellow envelope and walked toward the door with measured steps. Through the peephole, I observed Silas standing in the hallway with his small duffel bag, looking nothing like a man who'd just spent 6 days doing something worthy of guilt or shame. His hair was freshly cut, styled differently than usual. He wore a charcoal gray sweater I'd never seen before, paired with jeans that also appeared new. His entire appearance suggested someone returning from a rejuvenating vacation rather than an extended deception. I took a deliberate breath, steadied my hands around the envelope and opened the door. The sight of him standing there, looking so utterly comfortable and untroubled, nearly fractured the composure I'd been carefully constructing for this exact moment. Not because I missed him or felt residual affection, but because the complete absence of guilt on his face confirmed everything I'd come to understand about the person he'd become. Or perhaps had always been beneath the performance I'd mistaken for genuine partnership. His expression registered mild annoyance rather than contrition, as though the malfunctioning lock represented the primary inconvenience of his evening. His eyes met mine with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never seriously considered that actions might generate consequences. Then he spoke the words that would permanently crystallize my understanding of how completely our realities had diverged. "You should be thankful I even came home. Honestly, Eliza, after the week I've had, walking back in here feels like a sacrifice." The audacity momentarily stole my ability to respond. He'd vanished for 6 consecutive days with a fabricated story about a conference that didn't exist. He'd spent that time at a lakeside cabin with his project manager, engaging in the affair I'd been documenting for months. And now he stood in our hallway framing his return as some magnanimous gesture I should receive with gratitude. For a fraction of a second, I felt the deeply ingrained urge to accommodate, to smooth over tension, to prioritize his comfort over my own reality. That impulse had been trained into me through years of partnership where maintaining peace had gradually become more important than maintaining truth. But the weight of the envelope in my hands anchored me to the strategy Vivian and I had constructed. "You're right," I said, keeping my voice level and emotionless. "Thank you for coming home. But this isn't your home anymore." I extended the yellow envelope toward him, holding it in the space between us like a physical border marking territory he no longer had permission to cross. "Your early severance package. Everything you need to know is inside." Silas took the envelope with the confidence of someone who still fundamentally believed he controlled the narrative of our relationship. He tore it open without particular care, the same casual dismissiveness he might apply to opening routine mail, and began scanning the first page. I watched his face transform in real time, a masterclass in the physical manifestation of dawning comprehension. Confusion appeared first as his eyes moved across the legal language of the divorce petition Vivian had filed. Then comprehension as he turned to the second page and encountered the first of Marcus's photographs showing him and Jennifer at the lakeside cabin. Disbelief flickered across his features as he continued flipping through pages that documented his affair with timestamps, geotagged locations and financial records. His hands began trembling visibly around page 4, which contained credit card statements with highlighted charges for hotel rooms, restaurant dinners and the cabin rental. By the time he reached page 7, Vivian's comprehensive financial analysis calculating the $12,000 he'd dissipated on his affair, all color had drained from his face. "What is this?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper, his voice cracking midway through. "You can't just, this isn't legal. You can't lock me out of my own home." I leaned against the doorframe, maintaining the careful composure I'd practiced mentally for weeks. "Actually, this condominium is in my name exclusively. The lease I signed, the mortgage I'm currently assuming to buy out the building's equity, the security deposit I paid using my inheritance. All mine. You've been living here as my guest for the past 3 years, though I'll admit that legal distinction felt irrelevant when we were actually functioning as married partners. Past tense, as you'll note from the documentation." I watched him process this information, observed the precise moment when he realized I'd been strategizing comprehensively while he'd been focused exclusively on managing his affair logistics and assuming I'd remain conveniently oblivious. He attempted denial first, a predictable initial defense mechanism. "This evidence is circumstantial. Those photographs could be explained as work-related or..." "Page 5, I interrupted calmly, not allowing him to construct alternative narratives. "Timestamps, geotagged locations, credit card receipts creating an irrefutable timeline." Marcus was extremely thorough. "The cabin rental agreement is also included, signed in your name, charged to our joint account." His denial crumbled quickly, replaced by the equally predictable blame strategy. "You've been emotionally cold and distant for months, Eliza. Constantly prioritizing your consulting work over our relationship. Jennifer just understood me in ways you apparently stopped trying to. She actually listened when I talked about my projects instead of treating my career like background noise to your own ambitions." I let him complete the entire accusation without interruption, recognizing it as the standard script of someone attempting to redistribute responsibility for choices they'd made unilaterally. When he finally fell silent, I responded with the clarity I'd developed over weeks of processing his betrayal. "You chose to pursue an affair instead of initiating an honest conversation about relationship dissatisfaction. You chose to construct elaborate lies instead of leaving with integrity. You chose to spend $12,000 of our shared money funding that affair while allowing me to subsidize our legitimate household expenses. Every single choice in that sequence was entirely yours. My only choice was determining how to respond to your choices, and I chose documentation over devastation and strategy over suffering." Silas looked down at the papers again, then back up at me, searching desperately for the version of me who used to accommodate his moods, who used to pursue him for closure when he withdrew emotionally, who used to absorb his dissatisfaction and work to fix problems he'd never clearly articulated. That woman no longer existed in any form he could access or manipulate. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, his voice now stripped of the earlier arrogance, reduced to something smaller and more uncertain. "That's an excellent question you should have considered before spending a week at a lakeside cabin with Jennifer, charging the entire romantic getaway to our joint credit card," I replied evenly. "Your belongings are packed systematically in the guest room. You have exactly 1 hour to collect them before building security enforces the occupancy restrictions outlined in the management letter included in your documentation package." He attempted one final appeal, reaching for our shared history as though it could function as leverage against the present reality. "We were together for 12 years, Eliza. That has to mean something. You can't just erase 12 years. I felt something twist uncomfortably in my chest, not from nostalgia or residual affection, but from recognizing his attempt to weaponize our history against me, to use the foundation we'd built as an argument for why I should tolerate its destruction. It meant everything, I said quietly, holding his gaze. Past tense. You systematically converted those 12 years into a cautionary tale about taking partnership for granted. Congratulations on that particular transformation. I stepped back and began closing the door. Silas immediately placed his hand against it, Not with aggression but with the desperate energy of someone watching their reality restructure in ways they couldn't control or negotiate. Please. Can we just talk about this like adults? Have an actual conversation instead of this cold legal approach. I met his eyes one final time, observing the fear and confusion there, feeling absolutely nothing beyond a distant clinical interest in his psychological state. Adults don't disappear for 6 days without legitimate explanation, I said calmly. Adults don't construct fictional conferences to cover extended affairs. Adults don't spend marital resources on hotel rooms for extramarital relationships. You wanted to be treated like an adult? You're being served comprehensive divorce papers prepared by an experienced attorney. That represents the adult version of this conversation. Everything else is just negotiation, and I'm no longer interested in negotiating with someone who's been operating in bad faith for months. I closed the door with finality. The lock engaged with a solid click that felt like punctuation marking the end of a very long, painful chapter. Through the peephole, I watched Silas remain motionless in the hallway for nearly 2 full minutes, staring at the yellow envelope in his hands as though expecting it to transform into something different if he looked long enough. Eventually, he turned slowly toward the elevator, shoulders visibly slumped under the weight of consequences he'd genuinely never imagined would materialize. The elevator doors closed on his diminished figure, and I stepped away from the door, setting my hand against the wall to steady myself as the adrenaline that had sustained my composure began dissipating. It was finished. The confrontation I'd been strategically preparing for had concluded exactly as Vivian predicted it would. The apartment felt unnaturally quiet after Silas left. I remained standing near the door for several minutes, listening to the silence settle around me like physical substance. My hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had sustained my composure during the confrontation, and I pressed them flat against the cool wall to steady myself. The weekend passed in a strange suspended state where I existed somewhere between relief and anticipation. I knew the confrontation at my door represented only the beginning of a longer process, not a clean ending. Silas would need to process what had happened, and processing would inevitably lead to reaction. Monday morning arrived with unexpected developments that confirmed my instincts about consequences extending beyond our private dissolution. My phone rang at 10:15 with a call from an unknown number displaying a downtown Chicago area code. I answered cautiously, and a professional female voice introduced herself as Patricia Winters, Human Resources Director at Morrison & Associates. Mrs. Montgomery, I'm calling regarding information we've received concerning a relationship between 2 of our employees, she said, her tone carefully neutral in the way HR professionals master when discussing potentially litigious situations. We're conducting an internal investigation and wanted to inform you as a professional courtesy, given that you may be affected by these developments. I sat down slowly, uncertain what response was appropriate or expected. I appreciate you letting me know, I said carefully. Patricia continued with measured precision. When you called our office several days ago inquiring about a conference in Minneapolis, that inquiry was noted in our system as it raised questions about employee whereabouts and company representations. Subsequently, several staff members reported observing behavior between Mr. Montgomery and his project manager Jennifer Caldwell that appeared to violate our workplace conduct policies. We take these matters seriously, particularly when they involve supervisor-subordinate relationships that may create hostile work environments for other team members. I learned over the following days, through carefully worded updates Patricia provided and through information Marcus continued gathering, exactly what had unfolded at Morrison & Associates after Silas returned from his 6-day absence. Colleagues who'd previously overlooked or dismissed the dynamic between Silas and Jennifer as professional collaborations suddenly viewed their interactions through a different lens. Hushed conversations in conference rooms with doors closed. Extended lunches that weren't listed on calendars. The way Jennifer's face changed when Silas entered a room, and how his attention shifted immediately to her regardless of who else was present. Small behaviors that individually meant nothing but collectively formed a pattern multiple employees had independently reported to HR. The investigation moved with surprising speed, likely accelerated by Morrison & Associates' desire to address potential liability before it escalated into formal complaints or legal action. Jennifer, as a direct report to Silas, was in clear violation of the company's fraternization policy that explicitly prohibited romantic relationships within reporting structures. Within 2 weeks of the investigation's initiation, she was transferred to a different department working under a different senior designer, accompanied by a formal written reprimand that would remain in her personnel file. Silas faced substantially harsher consequences. As the supervisor in the relationship, he bore greater responsibility for maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. His demotion from senior designer to associate designer came with a corresponding salary reduction of approximately 18%. The high-profile municipal library project he'd been leading was reassigned to another senior designer. His professional reputation within the firm, carefully cultivated over 5 years, sustained damage that would require years to repair if repair proved possible at all. I hadn't engineered any of these consequences. I'd simply called HR to verify a conference, documented reality, and allowed that reality to generate its own momentum. The satisfaction I felt observing these developments was grim rather than celebratory, tinged with the recognition that multiple lives were being disrupted by choices Silas had made without considering collateral damage. Tuesday evening brought a complication I'd been trying unsuccessfully to prevent. My phone rang at 11 with my mother's name displayed on the screen, and I knew immediately that Nina's restraint had finally shattered. "Eliza," my mother began, her voice carrying an emotion I couldn't immediately identify as anger, disappointment, or confused hurt. "Nina told me about Silas. She told me everything." I closed my eyes, bracing for the conversation I'd been dreading since filing the divorce petition. "Mom, I was going to tell you when." "How could you not tell me?" she interrupted, her tone sharpening. "How could you make such a major life decision without discussing it with your family? Without even informing me that your marriage was in crisis?" The direction of her response caught me completely off guard. I'd anticipated sympathy, offers of support, perhaps questions about how I was managing emotionally. Instead, my mother seemed primarily upset about being excluded from the decision-making process. "I needed to handle this my own way," I said carefully. "I needed space to think clearly without." "Marriage is about working through difficulties, Eliza," she said, her voice taking on the lecturing tone I remembered from childhood when I disappointed her expectations. "You don't just throw away 12 years because of a temporary crisis. Have you considered counseling? Have you made any genuine attempt to understand what drove Silas to this behavior? What role your own actions might have played in creating distance between you?" Her words landed like physical blows. My mother, who'd always adored Silas, who'd praised his career accomplishments at every holiday gathering, who'd held him up as an example of the stable partner she'd hoped I'd find, apparently couldn't process that he'd systematically betrayed me. Instead, she was redirecting focus to my secrecy and questioning whether I'd adequately examined my own contribution to marital breakdown. I attempted explaining the evidence. The affair that had lasted months, not days. The $12,000 he'd spent from our joint accounts. The fictional conference and 6-day disappearance. The calculated deception that demonstrated this wasn't a momentary lapse but a sustained pattern of choices. My mother countered each point with traditional wisdom about forgiveness, commitment, and the complexity of long-term relationships. "Everyone makes mistakes, Eliza. Marriage means choosing to forgive and rebuild, not running to divorce attorneys at the first sign of trouble." The conversation deteriorated from there, eventually ending with my mother saying she needed time to process everything and me realizing with painful clarity that her support was conditional on my performing the role of wounded victim seeking reconciliation rather than strategic actor protecting her own interests. I sat on my couch after that call ended, feeling a different kind of betrayal settle into my chest. I'd lost my husband to his own choices, but I was also losing my mother's uncomplicated support because I'd refused to perform grief and helplessness in ways she found acceptable. Wednesday brought an unexpected confession from Claire that further complicated my understanding of how long I'd been navigating deception without recognizing it. She invited me to dinner at a quiet bistro in a neighborhood where we were unlikely to encounter anyone from our professional or social circles. Over wine I needed more than I wanted to admit, Claire made a confession that had clearly been weighing on her for months. "Eliza, I need to tell you something I should have mentioned a long time ago," she began, her face displaying the kind of genuine guilt that can't be manufactured. "Last December, probably around the 10th or 11th, I saw Silas having lunch with a woman at that Italian place on Randolph Street. Rossetti's, the one with the private booths in the back. She paused, gathering courage to continue. They were sitting in one of those booths, very close together, and something about their body language felt wrong to me. The way they were leaning toward each other, the way she was laughing, the way he was looking at her. I convinced myself I was misreading the situation, that I shouldn't plant suspicion in your marriage without concrete proof, that maybe she was just a colleague and they were discussing work in a comfortable way. Claire met my eyes with visible distress. When you called me asking for a divorce attorney referral, everything clicked into place immediately. I'd witnessed the affair in its early stages and said absolutely nothing. I convinced myself I was protecting you from potentially unfounded suspicion, but really I was just avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. I didn't know how to process this information. Part of me felt betrayed by her months of silence. Part of me understood the impossible position she'd occupied, trapped between potentially destroying my trust in my marriage based on ambiguous observation and potentially allowing me to continue investing in a relationship that was already compromised. I'm not angry, I said slowly, working through my reactions as I spoke. You were in an impossible situation. If you'd been wrong, I would have resented the suspicion. Since you were right, I resent the silence. There wasn't a good option available to you. Claire reached across the table, gripping my hand. I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you to handle difficult information. I should have trusted your strength instead of trying to protect you from potential pain. The conversation shifted something in our friendship, introducing new complexity but also deeper honesty. We talked for hours about the impossible ethics of friendship, about when loyalty means speaking uncomfortable truths, about how Claire's professional exposure to failing marriages had made her perhaps too cautious about intervening in mine. Thursday brought information from Marcus that I found grimly satisfying in ways that probably said unflattering things about my emotional state. He called mid-afternoon with an update I hadn't specifically requested but that Vivian had authorized him to continue gathering. Thought you should know your husband's romantic situation is deteriorating rapidly, Marcus said without preamble. Jennifer Caldwell is actively distancing herself from him. She's declining his calls, avoiding him at work beyond what's professionally required, and I observed her at a wine bar last night with a different man who appeared to be more than casual company. He continued in his characteristically dry tone. I also obtained text message content between Jennifer and one of her friends where she described Silas as becoming excessively dependent and dramatic now that the affair has professional consequences. Direct quote. He keeps calling wanting to talk about our future and I'm realizing he's just a guy who cheated on his wife, not some romantic hero. The whole thing feels exhausting now that it's not secret anymore. I absorbed this information with complicated emotions. The woman who'd participated in destroying my marriage was now abandoning Silas because consequences proved less romantic than secrecy. Affairs apparently thrived on deception and died when exposed to ordinary daylight reality. Vivian believes this information strengthens our settlement position, Marcus added. Demonstrates that Silas destroyed a 12-year marriage for a relationship that couldn't survive exposure, which undermines any argument that he deserves consideration for temporary emotional crisis or genuine alternative partnership. I thanked Marcus and ended the call, sitting quietly with the knowledge that Silas was now experiencing his own version of abandonment and betrayal. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly, more a grim recognition that consequences were distributing themselves with a certain organic justice I hadn't needed to engineer. The week following Marcus's update about Jennifer's abandonment of Silas brought developments that fundamentally altered my understanding of what I'd been navigating. I'd believed I was dealing with an affair, a betrayal of emotional and physical fidelity that had lasted several months. What Vivian's financial analyst uncovered suggested something far more calculated and substantially more disturbing. Vivian called me on a Thursday afternoon requesting an urgent meeting at her office. Her tone carried a weight I hadn't heard before, not quite anger but something close to controlled outrage on my behalf. I arrived within the hour and she had bank statements and financial records spread across her conference table like evidence at a criminal trial. Eliza, my forensic accountant, found something during the asset discovery process. Vivian began without preamble. Silas didn't just have an affair. He's been systematically planning financial separation for at least 6 months, possibly longer. She slid several documents toward me. Bank statements for an account I'd never seen before, opened at an institution we'd never used together, solely in Silas's name. The account had been established in early March, approximately 7 months before his 6-day disappearance. Over those months, he'd been redirecting portions of his quarterly bonuses and freelance consulting income into this hidden account rather than depositing them into our joint finances as he'd always done previously. The current balance was $28,417. I stared at the number, my brain struggling to process the implications. $28,000 that should have been marital property, that should have been contributing to our shared household expenses and future planning, secretly diverted into an account I'd known nothing about. He was building an exit fund, Vivian said, her professional composure cracking slightly to reveal genuine anger. While you were paying the majority of your household expenses from your consulting income, believing you were contributing to shared financial stability, he was constructing a separate financial foundation for whatever life he was planning without you. She pulled out additional documentation showing our household expense patterns over the same period. My consulting income had covered our mortgage, utilities, groceries, and most discretionary spending. Silas's base salary had ostensibly been contributing to joint savings and shared expenses, but the forensic analysis revealed that his actual contributions had decreased substantially starting in March while his income had remained constant. The difference had been flowing into the hidden account. This isn't impulsive infidelity, Vivian continued. This is calculated financial planning for abandonment. The affair with Jennifer wasn't a crisis or temporary breakdown. It was his audition for a new life he'd been methodically preparing to fund with money he stole from your marital partnership. The realization restructured everything I'd understood about the timeline and nature of his betrayal. The lakeside cabin, the expensive restaurant dinners, the gifts Jennifer had received, all of it had been funded by money he'd diverted from our shared future while allowing me to subsidize his daily existence. He hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been systematically robbing our partnership to finance his escape from it. I drove home from Vivian's office in a state of cold fury that felt qualitatively different from anything I'd experienced during the previous weeks. Betrayal of fidelity was devastating. Betrayal of trust was profoundly painful. But this level of calculated financial deception felt like a different category of violation entirely. The following day brought information from Marcus that added another dimension to my understanding of who Silas actually was beneath the performance I'd mistaken for authentic partnership. He called mid-morning with a tone that suggested he was delivering information he knew would be difficult to receive. I interviewed several of Silas's former colleagues as part of the background investigation for your settlement proceedings, Marcus began. One of them, a woman named Rebecca Hartley who left Morrison and Associates about 3 years ago, mentioned something that seemed significant enough to follow up on. He paused briefly before continuing. When I asked about Silas's professional reputation and character, Rebecca asked if this investigation was about his pattern of workplace relationships. Her exact words were, "I know Jennifer isn't the first because he tried the same approach with me during my first year at the firm." Marcus explained that he'd conducted a follow-up interview with Rebecca, who described Silas making persistent advances during her initial months at Morrison and Associates when she'd been a junior designer and he'd been a mid-level architect. She'd rebuffed him clearly and professionally and he'd eventually stopped, but the experience had made her uncomfortable enough that it had contributed to her decision to leave the firm for a position elsewhere. Rebecca had also mentioned rumors about another situation involving an intern named Michelle approximately 2 years before Jennifer, though that relationship had been more speculation among staff than confirmed fact. The timeline would have placed it during a period when Silas and I were still married, still supposedly committed to our partnership. "I can't definitively prove the situation with Michelle," Marcus said carefully, but Rebecca's direct experience combined with the rumors suggests Jennifer represents a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident or one-time mistake. I sat with this information for hours after ending the call, feeling the past rewrite itself yet again. How many of Silas's late nights at the office had actually been work? How many demanding projects had been cover stories for relationships that simply hadn't progressed as far as his involvement with Jennifer? How many times had I accepted his explanations about overtime and client meetings while he was actually pursuing or conducting affairs with colleagues? The pattern suggested that Jennifer wasn't the woman who'd tempted my faithful husband into uncharacteristic behavior. She was simply the most recent woman who'd said yes to advances Silas had apparently been making throughout our marriage whenever opportunity and receptiveness aligned. Vivian incorporated this information into our settlement strategy, using it to demonstrate systematic deception rather than a singular lapse in judgment that might warrant leniency or consideration of mitigating circumstances. The narrative shifted from husband who made a mistake during a difficult period to husband who maintained a pattern of infidelity and deception throughout the marriage. Sunday afternoon brought an unexpected and painful conversation with Nina that added yet another layer to my understanding of how extensively Silas had manipulated the people around him to insulate his deceptions. We met for coffee at a place near her apartment in Milwaukee, and she seemed agitated in ways that suggested she'd been carrying something difficult for some time. "I need to tell you something that's been making me feel sick since you told me about the affair," Nina said once we'd settled into a quiet corner booth. "Last Thanksgiving, do you remember when you were helping Mom in the kitchen for like an hour before dinner?" I nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "Silas and I ended up alone on the porch during that time," Nina continued, her voice tight with emotion. "I'd been noticing that he seemed different, distracted, and that you seemed stressed in ways you weren't talking about. So I said something to him. I told him I'd noticed he seemed distant from you lately, and that if he was having doubts about the marriage or going through something difficult, he needed to address it honestly with you rather than letting problems build." She paused, her hands gripping her coffee cup with visible tension. "He looked me directly in the eye, Eliza, with this completely sincere expression and said, 'Nina, I love your sister. You're just seeing work stress, not distance from her. Everything between us is fine. I appreciate you caring enough to check, but I promise you there's nothing to worry about.'" Nina's voice cracked slightly as she continued. "He lied to me so convincingly while he was actively cheating on you that I actually felt guilty afterward for suspecting there might be problems. He manipulated me into being his character witness, into reassuring myself that their marriage was solid, and I completely believed him." Her revelation explained the intensity of Nina's rage when I'd first told her about discovering the affair. Her anger hadn't just been protective fury on my behalf. It had been partially about her own sense of complicity, about having been weaponized against her own instincts and used to validate a false narrative. "That's why I wanted to confront him so badly," Nina said. "Why I had to force myself not to drive to Chicago and destroy something of his. He'd made me complicit in your deception. He'd used my trust and my love for you as a tool to further insulate his lies." I reached across the table and gripped her hand. "You're not complicit. He manipulated you the same way he manipulated me. That's what he does apparently. He constructs narratives and performs sincerity until people believe the version of reality he's selling." The final piece of understanding arrived unexpectedly while I was packing the remaining items from the guest room to be shipped to whatever address Silas had provided his attorney. Tucked between two architecture textbooks on the bottom shelf, I found a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. Professional ethics and basic respect for privacy suggested I shouldn't read someone's private journal. But curiosity and the need to understand what had actually been happening in the mind of someone I'd shared 12 years with overwhelmed those considerations. The entries dated back approximately 2 years, and they provided a window into Silas's internal narrative that was simultaneously illuminating and deeply infuriating. He'd written extensively about feeling underappreciated in our marriage, about how I'd supposedly changed after my career success and started earning more than him, about how our relationship had become emotionally stale and professionally competitive rather than supportive. The entries were masterful exercises in retrospective justification. He'd systematically rewritten our entire marriage history, reframing normal partnership dynamics as evidence of my failure to adequately appreciate or understand him. Quiet evenings working on separate projects became evidence that I'd stopped engaging with his interests. My career success became proof that I'd prioritized professional achievement over emotional intimacy. Normal relationship patterns that every long-term couple experiences were transformed into evidence of fundamental incompatibility. One entry from approximately 3 months before his disappearance read, "E doesn't understand ambition anymore. She's become too comfortable, too settled in her success. Jay makes me feel alive again, seen in ways I haven't felt in years, like the man I was before marriage domesticated me and turned me into someone I barely recognize." Reading those words crystallized something crucial. Silas hadn't betrayed me because our marriage was actually failing in any objective sense. He'd constructed a narrative of failure specifically to justify betrayal he'd already decided to commit. The journal was evidence of someone rewriting history to absolve himself of responsibility for destroying something that had actually been functional, if imperfect in the ways all long-term relationships inevitably become. I photographed the relevant pages carefully and sent them to Vivian, who responded within an hour that this documentation would be invaluable for demolishing any argument Silas's attorney might attempt to make about marital breakdown or shared responsibility for the relationship's dissolution. That evening, I sat in my condominium surrounded by the evidence of systematic deception that extended far beyond a simple affair, and I felt something shift in my chest. The shock and hurt that had characterized my initial responses to discovering his infidelity had transformed into something colder and more clarifying. I understood now exactly who Silas Montgomery was beneath the performance he'd maintained for 12 years. Someone capable of elaborate, sustained deception. Someone who rewrote reality to serve his own narrative needs. Someone who weaponized trust and manipulated the people who cared about him to insulate his betrayals. And I understood with absolute clarity that protecting myself from that person had been the most important decision I could have made. The settlement conference was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early November, approximately 6 weeks after I'd served Silas with the divorce petition at our condominium door. The intervening weeks had been consumed with document preparation, financial discovery, and the methodical construction of the legal case that would determine how our 12-year partnership would be formally dissolved. I arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes early, meeting Vivian in the lobby where she reviewed our strategy one final time. She carried 2 leather portfolios containing organized documentation of everything we'd gathered. Marcus's photographic evidence, financial records demonstrating asset dissipation and concealment, the journal entries I'd photographed, testimony from Rebecca Hartley about Silas's pattern of workplace relationships, and the findings from Morrison and Associates' internal investigation. Remember that settlement conferences are designed to avoid trial, Vivian instructed as we rode the elevator to the 4th floor. Judge Reeves will hear both sides and push toward resolution. Your job is to remain composed regardless of what Silas or his attorney say. Let me handle all substantive responses. The conference room was aggressively institutional. Fluorescent lighting, gray carpet, a rectangular table surrounded by office chairs that had seen better decades. Judge Reeves, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and an expression suggesting she'd presided over countless variations of this same painful scenario, arrived precisely at 9 and introduced herself with professional efficiency. Silas entered 3 minutes later with his court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Matthew Grant who appeared simultaneously overworked and underprepared. Silas looked substantially different than he had 6 weeks earlier at our doorway confrontation. Thinner, with shadows under his eyes that spoke to poor sleep and considerable stress. His suit hung slightly loose, suggesting weight loss he hadn't intended. When his eyes briefly met mine before he sat down across the table, I saw something that might have been shame or perhaps just exhausted resignation. Judge Reeves began by establishing ground rules and explaining the settlement conference process. Then she invited Vivian to present our position. Vivian's presentation was clinical and devastatingly thorough. She walked through the timeline of Silas's affair, supported by Marcus's photographic documentation showing him and Jennifer at the lakeside cabin, at restaurants, engaging in domestic activities that demonstrated an established relationship rather than isolated encounters. She presented the credit card statements demonstrating $12,000 in affair-related expenditures charged to our joint account. She introduced evidence of the hidden savings account containing $28,000 that Silas had systematically diverted from marital assets while allowing me to shoulder the majority of household expenses. She detailed the findings from Morrison and Associates' internal investigation, which had resulted in Silas's demotion and Jennifer's transfer due to violation of workplace conduct policies. She referenced Rebecca Hartley's testimony suggesting a pattern of inappropriate workplace relationships extending beyond Jennifer. She presented excerpts from Silas's journal demonstrating that he'd been constructing justifications for betrayal rather than responding to actual marital failure. Matthew Grant attempted to interrupt several times, trying to argue that Illinois was a no-fault divorce state where marital misconduct shouldn't influence property division. Judge Reeves cut him off with the weary patience of someone who'd heard this argument too many times to count. Counselor, while Illinois doesn't recognize fault as grounds for dissolution itself, Asset dissipation due to marital misconduct absolutely influences equitable distribution, she said firmly. Your client spent $12,000 of marital funds directly on an extramarital affair and concealed $28,000 in a separate account he established specifically to prepare for leaving the marriage. These are not neutral factors that the court can ignore when determining fair division of assets. Watching Silas sit across that conference table while his deceptions were catalogued publicly in official legal proceedings generated a complex emotional response I hadn't fully anticipated. Not satisfaction exactly, though there was an element of grim vindication in seeing his choices documented and acknowledged. More a sense of finality, of watching consequences crystallize into official record that would permanently define how our partnership had ended. Silas kept his eyes fixed on the table throughout most of Vivian's presentation, occasionally glancing at documents Matthew Grant slid toward him but never once meeting my gaze directly. His shoulders carried tension that spoke to acute discomfort with having his private betrayals examined in this sterile public forum. Judge Reeves called a 15-minute recess after Vivian concluded her presentation. I stepped into the hallway outside the conference room, needing distance from the claustrophobic space where my marriage was being systematically dismantled into financial calculations and legal terminology. Silas emerged from the conference room perhaps 2 minutes later. His attorney remained inside, likely reviewing documents or preparing whatever weak counterarguments might be available given the comprehensive evidence Vivian had presented. Silas approached me slowly, stopping approximately 6 feet away with visible hesitation. "Eliza, please," he said, his voice carrying a desperation I'd never heard from him during our 12 years together. "This has gone too far. We can still fix this situation. I made serious mistakes, I acknowledge that completely, but what you're doing now, destroying my career, taking everything, this feels vindictive rather than proportional." I looked at this man I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, and felt nothing beyond distant clinical observation. The emotional connection that had once defined my understanding of who I was in relation to him had been completely severed by the accumulated weight of his deceptions. "Vindictive would be public exposure beyond legal proceedings, Silas," I replied evenly. "Vindictive would be sending Marcus's photographs to every architect in Chicago. Vindictive would be contacting Jennifer's family to explain exactly how their daughter spent her weekends. What I'm actually doing is protecting assets you systematically attempted to steal and ensuring you bear appropriate financial consequences for choices you made freely and repeatedly over an extended period." He shifted approaches, his eyes developing a glossy quality that suggested either genuine emotion or performed distress. "Don't you remember who we were together? Don't those 12 years mean anything to you anymore?" I stepped slightly closer, lowering my voice so our conversation wouldn't carry to others in the hallway. "They meant everything to me until you decided they meant nothing. You don't get to retroactively weaponize our shared history after you spent 6 months systematically planning your exit and 6 days celebrating it at a lakeside cabin with your project manager." His face crumpled slightly at the directness of my response. Before he could attempt another argument, Judge Reeves's assistant called us back into the conference room. The final settlement terms were delivered with bureaucratic efficiency that reduced 12 years of partnership into 15 minutes of legal language. I retained full ownership of the condominium and the mortgage I'd been paying, with Silas receiving no equity share because Judge Reeves determined his marital misconduct had dissipated equivalent value. I received 68% of our remaining joint savings, calculated by taking the current balance, adding back the $12,000 he'd spent on affair-related expenses and the $28,000 he'd concealed in the hidden account, then dividing proportionally while accounting for my substantially larger financial contributions over the previous 3 years. Silas retained his personal belongings, his vehicle, and his retirement accounts minus a portion allocated to me representing the years when I'd financially supported his career during periods of income instability. Judge Reeves determined that no spousal maintenance was appropriate in either direction given that we'd both been self-sufficient professionals earning comparable incomes throughout most of the marriage. The entire dissolution of our legal partnership was articulated and formalized in less time than it typically took us to choose a restaurant for dinner. Matthew Grant offered Silas quiet reassurances that this represented the best possible outcome given the circumstances, which I recognized as legal euphemism meaning he'd had absolutely no leverage to negotiate better terms. I signed the settlement agreement with steady hands, each signature functioning as punctuation marking the definitive end of a very long, increasingly painful chapter. Silas signed with hands that trembled visibly, his attorney guiding him through each required signature line with patient instruction. Standing on the courthouse steps afterward, autumn wind cutting through my coat, I felt something shift in my chest. Not happiness or triumph, but a lifting of weight I'd been carrying for months. Vivian stood beside me, professional satisfaction evident in her expression. "You executed this perfectly," she said, and I understood she was offering professional assessment rather than personal comfort. "You documented comprehensively, protected yourself financially, and refused to let emotion compromise strategy. That's precisely why the settlement favored you so decisively." I watched Silas emerge from the courthouse entrance 20 feet away, Matthew Grant speaking to him in tones too low to hear while Silas stared at nothing in particular. He looked smaller somehow, physically diminished by the official acknowledgement of his choices and their consequences. For a brief moment our eyes met across the distance. I saw him searching my face for something, perhaps regret or residual feeling or some opening he might exploit to attempt reconciliation or renegotiation. I offered him nothing beyond neutral acknowledgement of his presence. Then I simply turned away, walking toward the parking structure where my car waited, moving deliberately toward the life I'd been methodically rebuilding while he'd been occupied destroying the previous version. Vivian accompanied me to my car, and before I opened the door she said something I would remember during the difficult weeks that followed. "Revenge isn't about making someone hurt proportionally to how much they hurt you," she said quietly. "It's about making certain you don't hurt anymore. You just accomplished exactly that." I drove away from the courthouse understanding that while the legal dissolution was complete, the emotional processing would continue for some time. But the foundation was established. I'd protected myself when protection was needed, responded to chaos with strategy rather than hysteria, and ensured that consequences landed where they legitimately belonged. The drive home from the courthouse felt different than any journey I'd made over the previous 6 months. The legal dissolution was complete, formalized through signatures and judicial approval that transformed 12 years of partnership into a historical fact rather than a present reality. The weight I'd been carrying since discovering that email on Silas's laptop had lifted partially, replaced by something that felt tentatively like the beginning of peace. The condominium I returned to that evening still carried traces of our shared life despite the changes I'd implemented during his 6-day absence. Over the following weeks, I began a more comprehensive transformation that would convert this space from a museum of memories into something that reflected only my own aesthetic and priorities. The repainting started the first weekend after the settlement conference. I'd hired painters initially, receiving quotes that seemed reasonable until I considered the therapeutic value of doing the physical work myself. The neutral beiges and grays that Silas had insisted represented sophisticated, resale-friendly choices disappeared under colors I'd wanted for years but had never advocated for strongly enough to override his preferences. Deep teal in the living room, a shade that caught light from the floor-to-ceiling windows in ways that shifted throughout the day. Warm terracotta in the bedroom, creating an atmosphere that felt restful rather than sterile. Soft sage in what had been our shared bedroom but was now being converted into a dedicated home office. Each wall I painted felt like reclaiming territory that had been ceded gradually over years of compromise that had somehow always tilted toward his preferences rather than representing genuine partnership negotiation. The physical labor proved unexpectedly therapeutic, the repetitive motion of rolling paint across surfaces allowing my mind to process emotions I'd been suppressing during the strategic phases of documentation and legal maneuvering. The furniture changes followed naturally. The modern sectional couch Silas had loved, which I'd always found aggressively uncomfortable despite never articulating that clearly enough to prevent its purchase, was donated to a charity that furnished apartments for families transitioning out of homelessness. The glass dining table that showed every fingerprint and watermark, requiring constant maintenance I'd somehow become solely responsible for, was replaced with a solid wood table from an estate sale that carried its own history and required no particular maintenance beyond normal cleaning. I purchased a vintage leather reading chair from a consignment shop in a neighborhood I'd never explored during the marriage, positioning it beside the window where morning light pooled most generously. That chair became my favorite space in the entire condominium, a location specifically designated for quiet mornings with coffee and books, activities that required no accommodation of anyone else's schedule or preferences. The bookshelves filled gradually with titles I'd been meaning to read for years but had somehow never prioritized during the period when maintaining a marriage had consumed energy I hadn't fully recognized I was expending. I hung photographs from solo trips I'd taken before meeting Silas, visual reminders that I'd existed fully and independently before our partnership and would continue existing fully after its dissolution. The transformation of physical space supported a parallel transformation of social connections that had been neglected or diminished during the marriage years. Claire and I navigated the complicated new dynamic our friendship had acquired after her confession about seeing Silas with Jennifer months before I'd confirmed the affair myself. We met for dinner regularly over several months, having conversations that were sometimes difficult but ultimately strengthened our connection through increased honesty. One evening in late December, over wine at the bistro where she'd made her initial confession, I told her something I'd been processing since that conversation. "I understand the impossible position you were in last December," I said carefully. "You were trying to protect me from potential false accusations while also respecting my agency to discover truth on my own timeline. Those were both valid concerns that created an impossible situation with no clearly correct choice." Claire's visible relief suggested she'd been carrying guilt about her silence for months. "I've been terrified that you'd never fully forgive me for not saying something when I first saw them together," she admitted. "I forgive you completely," I said, meaning it. "But I need you to promise that if you ever observe something concerning in the future, you'll trust me enough to handle difficult information. I'd rather process painful truth than continue investing in comfortable fiction." She agreed without hesitation, and our friendship deepened from that exchange. The honesty we'd established about her earlier silence created space for greater authenticity in all our subsequent interactions. I also reconnected with college friends I'd gradually drifted away from during the marriage years. Women who'd invited me to weekend trips that Silas had subtly discouraged through expressions of concern about the expense or questions about whether I really wanted to spend limited vacation time away from him. Career opportunities he'd questioned by raising doubts about whether the additional responsibility was worth the increased stress. Adventures he'd deemed impractical through gentle mockery disguised as affectionate teasing. Reconnecting with these women, I recognized with uncomfortable clarity how substantially I'd contracted my life to accommodate preferences and boundaries I'd internalized as reasonable partnership compromise. The world had always been larger than the version I'd been inhabiting. I'd simply stopped noticing the borders I'd accepted. Some relationships didn't survive the divorce. Several couples we'd been friendly with during the marriage gradually faded from contact, apparently uncomfortable with the messiness of dissolution or perhaps feeling obligated to maintain loyalty to Silas despite the circumstances. I noticed their absence but didn't particularly mourn it. Friendships built primarily on couple-based social activities rather than genuine individual connection proved unsustainable once the couple configuration dissolved. The relationships that remained and strengthened felt qualitatively different, more authentic, constructed on who I actually was rather than who I'd performed being as part of a partnership unit. 9 months after the settlement conference, on an unremarkable Tuesday in early June, I received a text message from an unknown number that initially generated mild curiosity about its origin before I read the content. "I understand now what I destroyed. I'm sorry for everything that happened. I hope you're finding happiness in your new life." I stared at the message for several minutes, sitting in my teal living room with evening light filtering through windows that framed a view I'd been looking at for years but had only recently started genuinely seeing. I waited to feel something significant. Rage at the inadequacy of his apology. Vindication that he'd finally acknowledged responsibility. Residual pain from the wounds he'd inflicted. Instead, I felt mild curiosity about what had prompted him to send this message now, followed by profound indifference that felt qualitatively different from the cold strategic detachment I'd cultivated during the divorce proceedings. This wasn't suppressed emotion. This was genuine absence of emotional investment, the psychological equivalent of observing a stranger's life from substantial distance. I didn't respond. The text wasn't really for me despite being addressed to me. It was for him, an attempt to alleviate guilt by performing contrition and seeking absolution I had no interest in providing. I deleted the message and blocked the number, actions motivated not by anger but by simple recognition that Silas Montgomery had become someone I used to know. A character in a story I'd finished writing and had no intention of reopening. That evening, I met Claire for dinner at our usual spot and mentioned the text during our conversation. "How do you feel about it?" she asked with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to recognize significant emotional moments. I considered the question honestly before responding. "Nothing," I said, recognizing the truth as I articulated it. "I feel nothing about him specifically and everything about my life as it exists now. That's how I know I've actually healed rather than just performing healing." Claire raised her wine glass with a slight smile. "To nothing," she said, acknowledging both the absurdity and profound truth of the toast. We both laughed, and the conversation moved naturally to other topics that comprised our current lives rather than dwelling on the past that had been processed sufficiently to no longer demand constant attention. The yellow envelope that had represented the culmination of my strategic response to betrayal found permanent residence on a shelf in my home office, positioned where I'd see it whenever I worked but not so prominently that it dominated the visual space. Friends who visited occasionally noticed it and asked about its significance with curiosity that suggested they recognized it meant something beyond ordinary office supplies. "A reminder that documentation defeats manipulation," I'd explain when asked. "And that strategic thinking produces better outcomes than emotional reaction." Some people laughed nervously, unsure whether I was joking. Others nodded with recognition that suggested they'd navigated their own difficult situations requiring similar approaches. A few asked for Vivian's contact information, which I provided without hesitation. Late one night in early autumn, nearly a year after serving Silas with divorce papers at my condominium door, I pulled the yellow envelope from its shelf and examined its contents one final time. The photographs Marcus had taken. The financial records demonstrating systematic deception. The legal documents that had formalized the dissolution. I smiled slightly at Vivian's handwritten notation on one page. "Client exhibited exceptional strategic thinking throughout. Recommend as model for effective divorce preparation." I realized with clarity that had developed gradually over months that the yellow envelope had never actually been about revenge despite how the confrontation might have appeared to external observers. Revenge would have implied wanting Silas to suffer proportionally to the pain he'd caused me. What I'd actually wanted, what I'd methodically achieved, was protection from ongoing harm, accountability for choices that had damaged our partnership, and dismantling of power imbalances he'd created and maintained through sustained deception. I'd wanted him to carry the appropriate weight of his own choices rather than successfully distributing that weight onto me through guilt, financial manipulation, or narrative reconstruction that reframed his betrayals as somehow jointly caused by marital dysfunction. The envelope went back on its shelf, transformed from a weapon into a monument marking the precise coordinates of my transformation from someone who'd absorbed betrayal into someone who'd protected herself when protection became necessary. That night, I went to bed in a condominium that belonged entirely to me legally, financially, and emotionally. The silence that filled the space didn't feel empty or lonely. It felt complete, the natural atmosphere of a life reconstructed according to specifications I'd developed independently rather than through negotiated compromise with someone whose preferences had somehow always carried disproportionate weight. I'd learned something essential through the process of discovering betrayal and strategically responding to it. Peace doesn't emerge from revenge that balances suffering. Peace doesn't come from reconciliation that papers over fundamental violations of trust. Peace comes from the quiet certainty that you protected yourself when protection was needed, that you responded to chaos with strategy rather than matching it with equivalent chaos, and that you closed doors that should never have been opened while walking deliberately forward into a future only you define. If this story of strategic justice had you completely gripped, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Eliza handed Silas that yellow envelope at the door and watched his face drain of color as reality hit him. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.